Good afternoon. It's lovely to see so many. On behalf of the Liberton Kirk Guild, can I welcome you to all our yesterdays. The Guild theme for this year is Wee Seeds, Big Trees. And today's event came from a wee seed, which has certainly grown over the last few months. Some of us have been privileged to listen to stories from Anne, Bill, and Elizabeth as they tell us what life was like in Liberton over the last 90+ years. There may be some similarities in their stories, but there are also many differences. The stories are told well and are certainly stories for sharing. So thank you to the three of you for agreeing to share them with us today. We are also highly privileged that Alan Campbell has agreed to take part in our programme. Alan, as you all know, is an enthusiast, and he takes a deep interest in local history. He is diligent, he is painstaking in his research, and he is an excellent communicator. So thank you, Alan, for all the work that you have done to bring us here today. And Alan has also unearthed a surprise for us, which I think involves Pearl Kelly. As you came in this afternoon, Callum was playing the organ, and we were showing photos of old Liberton. These photos have been collected by Callum, and we're delighted that he has agreed to share them with us today. Over 100 photographs, but I think by the time he leaves today, he's going to have an awful lot more than 100 photographs. In the second part of our afternoon, Callum will be talking about some of the photographs in greater detail. I do hope you enjoy your afternoon. Thank you.
The word unique is used, I think, in our media far too much, but today I feel is a very apposite use of the word. Because though there are people in the building here today who are slightly older than these three people, they are not looking at 30 years of corporate memory of Liberton. We're looking at nearly 300 years of corporate interest. They were all born in this area. They were all brought here as babies and christened here. They've been brought up through our church. Because there's such a sort of panoply, I'm only going to focus on 4 themes which they've been doing homework on. But if we have some time in between these themes, I'm going to do some sort of one-liners. Some of them are historically accurate, some are slightly on the edge. This great book that Anne has, this is the famous George Zagood's book of 1893 that I'm sure many of you know off by heart. This is the history of Liberton up to 1893, and it's one of the most detailed books I've read in a long time. I've been through a couple of times. Also, we'll talk about 1 or 2 key dates in the history of Liberton Church, 1 or 2 of the ministerial characters, and there have been quite a lot in the history of Liberton Kirk, and there will be a bit of music, which the three have chosen to take them back to their childhood. A lot of people in the church I know do their own local history, and it's nice to have members of the Liberton Historical with us today. Peter Schwartz obviously does a lot of work on census records and also his own house on Skirtbrae. But this is really not meant to be an exhaustive history of the last 1,000 years. This is more looking at the personal lives of 3 people who have really spent their whole days here. And we're going to start off with some music. And I'm going to ask Anne to speak about why she's chosen her piece, and then Callum will play it for us.
Well, my choice might seem a bit odd today. But when Alan mentioned that he would like us to think about a piece of music, I couldn't really think over, although I was brought up with music, of a particular piece. But as I thought about that, this tune came into my head, and I realized that it was from way back, from probably before the war, and it was Golden Slumbers. I don't know how many of you would know it today, probably not. And I had this memory vague memory of my mother sitting, playing, accompanying my aunt, who was quite a good singer. And I think she sang with choirs and Gilbert and Sullivan and that sort of thing. And I think she probably also went out to sing, because I vaguely remember my mother going with her for that sort of occasion. So I think it was our sort of theme song. And I thought, well, that's quite interesting, because I remembered the music. I didn't remember the words, but I remembered the music almost completely. So that's my choice for today. Nothing to do with Liberton.
Okay, Callum. What was it like, Elizabeth, being brought up in this area? Because you started off in the Aince, am I right, and then moved up to up to Cannae Hills. If you tell us about your early days together as brother and sister, because your dad worked in the area, didn't he?
Yeah. My mother was down in the Aince. My grandfather was the head gardener at the Aince estate, and had that gardener's house, which is still there, and that was our first family home with my grandfather. And then we moved, when my grandfather retired, we moved across to a cottage at Bridge End. And from there, when I was about 4-year-old, I think, we moved up to Annickhill Road. And at that time, it was just new housing. And we were in 168, next to us was the field, behind us was the field, and just the houses were just built one at a time going up Annickhill Road. And that's where we started off as a family. Yep. And my grandfather came with us, of course, to that time.
And you went to school here?
I went to Liberton School. I've got my Liberton badge on. They had Liberton School served quite a large area. We had a girl from Blackford Glen Road. Boy who stayed in the Conan Doyle house.
Okay.
And then there were 2 families from Kingston Avenue, and Ellen's Glen Road, Gracemount, St. Catherine's, Liberton Drive.
Do you want to say something about your early life? What did you sort of play? Did you play games outside in the streets, or how did you sort of amuse yourselves?
In the streets, at that time, streets were very, very quiet. You could roller skate on the main road.
Couldn't do that.
No. There were very few buses. A bus every half hour.
Right.
And then very few cars.
So at that time, did such trams come as far as Liberton Crossroads, or?
Kirkgate, the shops at the terminus there.
You know quite a lot about shops, so tell us more about the shops in the area, because you seem to know quite a lot because you were involved in the retail trade.
The main shops were on the Liberton Bray, and there were few shops round on Lastways Road, but people like Anne's parents had to travel to Liberton Bray for shopping.
Yeah, and carry it back. Now, Anne, you lived further up
Yes,
Obviously,
yes.
and you've only moved a short distance in your whole life.
Well, that's true. My father's family lived in Blackford Glen Road, and my mother's family lived in Orchard Head Road. I think probably the houses were just built when they moved there. My mother and my father were still at school when they moved. I'm not quite sure about times, but they were both at Boroughmuir, and my aunt was Boroughmuir, and my uncle was at Harriet's. And they walked to school every day. And in those days, the tram terminus was at Gilmerton Road End.
Yes.
And they had a penny for the tram if it was wet. It had to be very wet before they were allowed to use the penny. And then my father's father decided to move up to Kames. And he got some land and built a house there. Before it was in Edinburgh, because he had gas lighting in the house, not electricity. When we eventually bought the family house, and all the electric wiring was on the surface of the rooms, because it had all been added later on, we did manage to bring it up to date. But because we were up there, we had problems, well, not problems, but it wasn't easy to get into town because there were very few buses, one or two going to Pennycook, other one going to Lasswade. So we walked to the tram terminus at Liberton Crossroads and got the tram in. So it was a regular thing in the morning going to school, because I was at school in Edinburgh, that you walk down to the tram terminus and you walk back after school in the afternoon. I don't think you ever thought anything about it.
One of the other, obviously, the area around Liberton and Gilberton was an area of natural resources. The soil was very good, as Gladys's family can tell you from the family farms, and that's where we see these names still carrying on. Number 11 bus to Highbit's Bank is also heavy oats. That was the main crop that was grown up there. And also the area was very, very rich in lime and limestone. A lot of quarrying work on this area, and you see that still reflected in Barrett's housing. Is called lime kilns. So the actual names carry on from the actual work that was done. A lot of the buildings of Edinburgh, a new town would have been, a lot of the produce for building the limestone and cement would come from this area. Where you had mills, obviously, for cereal, where you had limestone, where you had carriers, you also had public houses. And in this parish at one time there were 40 public houses to meet the needs, physical and otherwise, of the population. There were obviously big mills at Strayton, and then, surprise, surprise, Cameron Tall, round the corner is Peffer Mill, which had obviously a mill and a pub. So these were very much part of the hubs of the area. And we're going to have some more music. Elizabeth's going to tell us about her choice of music.
My choice of music is the Blue Danube. We were at Liberton School. The music teacher came into the school on particular days, and she always played the Blue Danube every time she came. And we sat and listened to Blue Danube. We were supposed to be doing a singing lesson, but the only song that I remember we ever had was Bobby Shaft Was Gone to Sea. And apart from that, the Blue Danube is my memory of music at Liberton School.
Okay, Callum, thanks. Now, most of your school days would obviously be overlapping with actual wartime. Now, I know Elizabeth and Billy, you had an interesting experience because your house was being used for part of the school, but you couldn't go to that part of the school.
No.
Have you explained that to the folks here?
Well, the auxiliary fire service took over Liberton School, which is now the nursery school. And from there, we were moved down to what was the Unionist Hall, just where the Park Crescent comes out onto Mount Vernon Road. But of course, that was far too small for 5 classes that we had. So we were brought back up to the Anderson Hall. There was no recreation hall, no foyer. It was just the Anderson Hall, the small hall at the back, and the cloakrooms and the kitchen in between. And for a while it worked out quite well. We were in our little classes, but they discovered that it wasn't really suitable. So they arranged for certain houses in the area to take some of the pupils for special classes at special times. And we were at 168 Annickhill Road, and my mother arranged for the class to come there, but you weren't allowed to be in that class.
No.
You had to go to the...
We travelled down to the lodge at the entrance into Liberton Hospital. That was one place we went to.
And then eventually we got back into the school again. It just wasn't working. And at that time we used to get little gold or silver stars if we were extra special working in our homework. And when we got back into the school, all the gold and silver stars were up in the ceiling. So that was what the auxiliary fire service did. And then for a time, I went from Annickhill Road down to Hawkhead Crescent to my teacher, and which she would hear our reading, give us arithmetic to do, and then she would go back again, perhaps 3 days later, and have another session with her, just a one-to-one, really. But it was a very disruptive time in our education. So,
and yours was a bit different. You had travelling to do, didn't you, to school?
Yes, well, I was at school in Edinburgh. I was at George Square, as George Watson's Ladies' College was known as. And when the war started, the Red Cross took the school over, just like that. And to begin with, I had a similar experience to Elizabeth, because the school managed to find enough parents who were willing to let out a room for 5 days a week. There were various teachers sent to these houses, and I went to the McNiven's house in the Kirk Gate, which was nice and handy for me. And during that time, the girls' school was negotiating with the boys' school that we should share it. So that's what happened for a while. One term the boys would go in the morning, the girls would go in the afternoon, and then it was turned around the next term. And of course, never the twain shall meet. So it was, hurry up, girls, out. And then eventually we got back to George Square. And I can remember the teachers having to do fire duty at night. I think there was always 2 teachers in school in case there was a raid. And strangely enough, I remember the fire buckets full of sand.
Oh, yeah.
And at the end of this great long dark passageway, as it was known, and eventually, they stopped doing that. But as Elizabeth says, it was a very disruptive 2 or 3 years, actually.
And am I right that in this area also there were some army camps, weren't there? There was the...
There were, but that was later on in
Right.
the war. That was when there was a camp up at Morton Hall.
Yes.
And it was German prisoners waiting to be...
That's right. You can still see some of the actual foundations still left if you look in the long grass there.
Yes, that's right. And they were waiting for repatriation back to Germany. And the army captain or whatever who was in charge sent a letter around to people in the area saying that these men would be happy to do some jobs if we were prepared to have them. And it so happened my father spoke quite good German and he was interested. So we had several German prisoners to do jobs. And the last one we had was a chap called Willy Tesch. And he and my father got on like a house of art. They liked the same music. They seemed to have a lot in common. And he kept in touch after Willy went back. But he lived in Lubeck, and it ended up in the Russian zone, so very soon he didn't hear any more from them.
Now, obviously, like many people during lockdown, you do your hour's walk, and I walked in so many different directions, and I kept noticing names of streets and recording them and thinking, there must be a reason for that street being called that street. And I've got a whole list, but I'm only going to mention two of them that I think are quite interesting and relevant today. There's a very small street just not far from St. Catherine's Catholic School, which is called the name of Priest Hill, terrace, very short street, Priest Hill Terrace. And that is the only origin back to the area used to be known as Priest Hill, but post the Reformation, it was regarded that you didn't want an area called Priest Hill, and it was changed to Grace Mount, which is the obvious. But that is still that very short street. The one that is better known and really covers a much larger area is if you go further east to that, there was a massive forestry area, and the forest was so good, it was called Good Trees. And lovely area, and people though began to eat away at this forest and put houses and bits of farms and chickens and whatnot. And unfortunately, being Edinburgh, sadly, the word sort of good trees was a bit hard to say, so it came to be shortened as gutters. The chap who owned the forest did not really like the fact that his lovely forest was called gutters. But he had a cousin who had a lovely estate in Perthshire called Morden. And he decided that as from whatever date, that this would now be called Morden. Now the name of Good Trees, though, of course, as most of you know, is still seen on the street names, and also the community centre is called Good Trees Community Centre. Now moving along, we're actually moving back the way to 2006. Because in 2006, November of that year, the Liberton Guild had a session called Liberton Memories. And it was, I'll give you a shout. It's okay. Liberton Memories. And that was a particularly interesting evening, and it was led by a certain Anne Weir and Christine Seaton. Many of you will remember Christine Seaton. And we have here the original handwritten script for the 2006 evening. My wife has very kindly, faithfully typed up the handwritten scripts, and we've got some hard copies also, and we can send email copies for anybody who was there or would like to know what actually was said. Because we think the meeting was chaired by Margot Brandy, though Margot's not 100% sure, but we are reliably informed that it was chaired by her. Speakers were Anne Weir and Christine Seaton. We had an input from Ruth Davis, who chipped in about moving into the area, and the music on that occasion was not Callum. The music was provided, and I'm very pleased she's here. Anne Noble provided the violin music on that evening. She played some Scottish reels and an unnamed piece from Elgar, very posh, she was doing that night. So Sally Cuthbert was certainly there, and there may be others. I'm very sorry if I've not got to. But I thought it'd be nice to have a link to that evening, because one of the things that took place, and we have the script of that bit, was a poem which was written by the late Wilma Monroe. Now, apparently she wrote poems, and she would have read the poem on that day. So I've asked Pearl to come up and read Wilma Monroe's poem. Can I just say it's called The New Bride, and she's going to read it in a minute. Don't Google it. Now, the reason I'm saying that is this poem is not on the internet. There is a poem on the internet called The New Bride, but it's about a drug-fueled suicide. So it's not quite as the thing we normally promote in Liberton Kirk Guild. But anyway, I'll hand over to Pearl, and just imagine you're back in 2006.
It's called The New Bride, yes. Oh, you'll never be a housewife, my mother said to me. You canna make a pancake or a decent cup of tea. Oh, you're very good at cleaning. That all will agree. But you canna feed a working man on tins of Bansham polish. Now, my hoose is shinin, and everything is new. But my man had indigestion when he ate my Irish stew. The simple rules of cookery I just canna master. My attempt at ratatouille was an absolute disaster. I'm no so bad with brussel sprouts or cauliflower or peas. And I made him macaroni, but forgot to add the cheese. When I gave him mince and mealie, no wonder he was frowning. For I'd used instant coffee instead of gravy browning. Aince I tried to make a soufflé. Oh, it was rubbery and hard, and I pretended not to notice when he gave it to the cat. And my special treacle dumpling that he valiantly supped resembled a volcano ready to erupt. Now, I scorned my mither's good advice, but now I wish I took it. Oh, I guess I must eat humble pie, as long as I didn't hate to cook it.
Now, obviously, when you weren't at school or at home, you maybe went on holidays. So, Bill, what kind of holidays did you go? Did you go very far? Did you go to Lanzarote or Tenerife?
A long distance down to Dunbar.
Oh, well.
The family took a house, and preparations for this holiday, your mother's had a cabin trunk, and
yes, oh, well.
Took all the clothes and everything we needed for the
How long would you go away for? 2 weeks?
Oh, about a week.
Just a week?
A week, Mm-hmm. The trunk was sent down to the luggage office on Waverley Bridge, and then it went ahead of you to your holiday destination.
Yeah,
so it was there when you arrived.
Highly organised, on time.
So yes.
So did you go overseas at all? You didn't go abroad at any time, or?
Not till very later on in life, no.
Not even to Scarborough?
Holidays on the west coast and maybe as far as Burnt Island, you know.
And your family had very strong links with Cramond, I presume.
Yes, my grandfather, the Orchard Head Road one, they had a wee house out of Fairfar in Cramond, and I gather that the family went out to this little house probably the beginning of the summer, and my mother and aunt and uncle and my grandfather all travelled by train into Edinburgh from Barnton, which I find very hard to understand, but I remember her insisting, yes, that was the way that it was done. So I went to Cramage a bit because of, you know, my mother's memories, but my father was golf mad, so as a family we went to Carnoustie until coming home after the start of the war, the siren went when we were in the train on the Forth Road, I was going to say the Forth Road Bridge, and the Forth Road, a railway bridge, and my mother said, well, that's it. I'm not crossing this bridge again in the wartime. So we went to North Berwick, which was lovely for me. And I had two uncles that were farmers, so I went there.
North Berwick and Dunbar, eh? What more could you? Yes. What more could you want?
Yes.
And you had some postcards, you know.
Yes.
Yeah, it was amazing. Anne was telling me that people could post postcards in Cramond in the morning to say that they were coming home in the afternoon, and they would be delivered to our house in Captain's Road before the people arrived in the afternoon. Which is, I think they've made progress. Come on.
Absolutely. Yes. It's quite incredible. People, the time I was thinking about, people didn't have telephones, of course. And I got my granny's postcard album and sorted it all out. And I think there's a lot of history in that book. And, you know, reading the back of them, see you this evening for tea. That was posted in the morning.
Bill, you've got our final piece of music. Tell the folks why you've chosen it.
Well, it may seem a strange request, but happy memories and the memories of holidays on the West Coast. So
you've chosen
Mull of Kintyre.
Kintyre. Happy holidays on the West Coast, Callum. Thank you. Obviously, a lot of your life was centred around the church. And this church, as we all know, has been going for a very long time. And I just went home in on a couple of interesting dates. I found a record that in the year 1800, they had to erect tents outside the church within the walls because so many folk were coming to the communion services. And in 1884, there was a petition for a harmonium, but it was only to be used for psalmody practice and had to be covered up on the Sabbath. 1907, the church was asked to look at investigating a pipe organ. The initial vote went against that, but 7 years later, they approved the purchase of a pipe organ. And Callum has written a very good booklet on organs in this church if you want to have a look at it. And just the last one, just to throw in randomly, 1935 was the first tennis court As most of you know, at the back of the Anderson Hall is Centre Court, and that was opened in 1935. I shall just home in on a couple of, as I say, there's been some really, really interesting ministers in this church. Some of them have lasted a long number of years. Some of them have not lasted very long, and they met their end, really. But I'll just home in on one. 1898, Dr. Gray retired and left the church. And a vacancy committee was appointed very quickly. But several members of the congregation thought it would be a wonderful idea if the assistant minister, Robert Burnett, just stood up because he was doing very, very well. For some reason, I don't know why, but the vacancy committee didn't like Robert Burnett. And they said, no, sorry, we're going to cast our net wider. They did cast their net wider, and I find this, considering the Church of Scotland's current situation of restructuring and slimming down, they did not like any of the other 95 applicants. I'll say that sentence just one more time. They did not like any of the other 95 applicants in 1894. Now, anyway, to cut a long story short, the church split. Basically, the vacancy committee said, well, if you don't like our ideas, we're taking our ball. And they went away and formed what is Priestfield Congregation in Dalkeith Road. The good news is that those who left, those who stayed, called Mr. Burnett, and he was very happily minister here for 30 years and seemed to be quite acceptable. In fact, Anne can think of Mr. Burnett being around. So thinking about church life, for most of you, the first time you would have been in church as babies was at christening. And I think we've got something here. He disappears in the back. And I think Anne wants to show you something.
Not really.
This is Anne's christening robe. And it was her mother's christening robe.
And my
as
granny's.
Well. So, well, tell us a bit about coming to church in Liberton and about anything you know about this particular robe.
Well, I don't remember, well, I remember coming, I suppose when I was quite young, and my granny sat in the front seat in the East Gallery, and my uncle, who didn't really want to go to church at all, and 2 or 3 Bibles have covered his drawings. He drew on the blank pages, the front and the back. So I think my granny gave up and just kept him quiet. And then, of course, like probably both of you, went to Sunday school and Bible class. And then I remember my mother saying, it's time you joined the church. Not, what about joining church? Have you thought about it? No, just it's time you joined the church. So I duly did, and that was fine. But I wasn't really terribly involved in Liberton activities other than brownies, I think.
So, I know some of you have talked to me about picnics. You want to tell me about church picnics, Elizabeth?
Yes, well, I did Sunday school work with the youngest group for about 10 years. And, of course, again, during wartime, we couldn't travel very far. But on one occasion, we were taken along to the farm at Braid Hills, Meadowhead farm for our picnic. Mm-hmm. And of course, it was a field where the cows were usually out. And we went along in the morning and cleared up and made it very nice and tidy. But by the time we went back in the afternoon, the cows had been out again. So I'm afraid it was a bit of a disaster. But I think one time you were taken by train to...
Well, we went by tram to Newington Station.
Right.
Got on the train, the suburban line. Yes, and over to Fife So that...
I remember that, and somebody got lost.
Well, I can't remember that, Anne, but...
in Fife. Oh, dear.
So I think most of us were sent home, and I don't think they found us. Boy, until sort of later on in the day, panics.
And you had to take your tin can with you to...
I was brought up in Glasgow and done a bit in Edinburgh, but in Glasgow every Sunday school picnic was tunnocks. And you had a tunnocks box, as it was called, and therefore it was dead easy for the sort of catering, because basically everybody got the same box, and it had your sausage roll, sandwich, cake, and of course tunnocks caramel wafer in the box. And that was dead easy for handing out. But I remember going on a picnic to Helensburgh, the Blue Train. You could actually hire a whole sort of, it's a coach, for a church could take over a coach and go down on the actual Blue Train to Helensburgh. So that was on the picnic. I mean, how big would Sunday school be in these days? Were we talking of a lot of children?
Oh yes, well, by that time, Gracemount had been built and a lot of new houses, and we had a very large group of youngsters at that time.
And didn't you also, you had joint events with Birdie House, didn't you?
Yes, I remember that.
Yes, we did, yes.
That's a long time ago.
Yes, yes, a long time ago.
Now, Anne, you've been involved in church catering a lot over the years. And I'm sure we could, so if you could just summarise all that in 90 seconds, tell us a little bit about catering in Liberton.
When John Cameron came to be minister here, I think he wanted to have a more outward-looking church and more church events and that sort of thing. And I knew him vaguely before he came, and he knew I'd been at Domestic Science College, and so had Christine. So the pair of us started to do some, we had elders district socials and all sorts of things in a dreadful, dreadful church kitchen. Absolutely terrible. However, eventually we got a new kitchen. But when I think about it, we had a gas ring that took a 5-gallon urn, and if we had a special do, we made real coffee, and that insisted on filling up this urn with milk and water and dangling a bag with coffee grains in the top of it, which was fine, except that on one occasion we were having a coffee evening, and the Harry Peck, I don't know how many of you remember him.
Yes.
He was trying to be terribly helpful. He was the church caretaker, and he turned it on so it would be nice and warm for us. Hi. So when we came in early evening, all we could smell was burned milk. Panic stations sending husbands out for jars of Nescafe milk. However, we had some good fun.
Elizabeth Bill, any memories of ministers in particular? Any ministers that you were maybe worked a lot with? Or?
We, during the war years, and we had various elderly ministers came at that time, but well, I was christened by Dr. Ewan.
Oh, yes.
And then we had Mr. Fernbach was back again into the church before Mr. Cameron, wasn't it? Yes. But at that time, during the war years, Dr. Guthrie's school,
oh, yes, of course,
and the boys used to come from Dr. Guthrie's school and sat up in the back row, up in the gallery.
I remember Guthrie's boys. And as I was saying to you, what I remember about them was when these lads came to Guthrie's, Mr. McAllister, who was the headmaster, and I think he was a very good headmaster, they were given a suit, and they were allowed to choose from about 3 different colours of tweeds. So these little boys, well, they weren't all terribly small, they came into church on Sunday morning, all in their tweed suits. You remember that?
Yes.
And I mean, some of them I think were pretty awful, but there was one boy in John Cameron's day who was a real tearaway, and he came to Guthrie's, and eventually he really liked it. And he was quite a changed lad, and he was sent home. But home was so awful that he started being bad again in the hope that he would be sent back to Guthrie's. And I think he actually was.
What was between the church and your house? I mean, was it just fields between Liberton Kirk and then where you are on Captain's Road?
Well, there was the houses up Liberton Gardens, and then there was nothing until
Fields.
the fields. Yes, fields apart from the farm cottages up near Rannoch Hill. Yes, and of course it was still Morton Hall. There was still an estate in there. No, there was really nothing. And I don't know about you, but I can remember vaguely walking home in a winter afternoon in the dark from the tram terminus. And I suppose it's quite interesting. Nobody worried about that. I didn't worry about maybe 8 or 9, you know, during the time that we were sharing the boys' school.
Okay, I think we'll call a halt there at the moment, but please feel free to speak to them afterwards. Thank you so much for sharing just that very sort of slice of life. I think you've sparked off quite a few memories in people here of their experience, either of this area or of their own childhood, wherever that was. I think we should just give them a round of applause.
Scene from 1919, and you can see here that the city is clearly very distant from Liberton, over 2 miles to the north. The road that's coming from the south is Lasswade Road, and Edinburgh is away to the north right of the scene. Compare it to what we have now. Liberton is halfway between the General Post Office and the city boundary. You've perhaps heard the term used, Greater Liberton, and that speaks to the time when Liberton was made up of 4 distinct settlements. At the top of the hill here, we have Kirk Liberton, with the church nearby. If you went to the left along what's now Liberton Drive, we'll get to Over Liberton, or Upper Liberton. And going down the hill, we come to Liberton Dams, so-called because of the lathes and the mills that were there. And going further north, sort of where Cameron Toll is, we come to Nether, being Lower Liberton. And this photograph's taken from a biplane, or maybe even a balloon. So we're going to land this balloon, and we're going to go on a journey through the decades around Greater Liberton. And we land at the convent of the Poor Clares on Lasswade Road. The building went up around 1896. And what we see here from the left is the main accommodation. We have the priest's occupancy of the gable end building, and then the chapel to the right. We've noticed today, and I've got one of these, there's a kennel. We hadn't spotted that till this afternoon. Some dog lived there. Now, I have some friends awaiting us on this journey, and we've been invited in, so let's go inside. And we see a very ornate altar. We have Madonna on the left, and we have St. Clair being received into the altar by St. Francis. A much later scene, they've simplified the altar, but what it shows is the shutters where the nuns in the enclosed order could receive Mass with the general public. And now we're going to go outside and head into Kirk Liberton. But we just pause and look back south, and we can see the convent in the distance. And notice what has changed. The year's now 1910, and changed from today. There's no lampposts. There's no driveways, and there's, of course, a distinct lack of traffic. Those railings are still there today, but covered by foliage. But what is good to see is that that 31 bus was still pumping up and down that road even back then, you can see. Slightly further north, we stop again and turn south. We're outside Dr. Guthrie's Industrial School. Now on the left looks to be a tavern, based on the sign, and some gentlemen outside. The single-storey building is near Margie Ottis's now. That seems to be a tea room, possibly, based on some signs I've read. And let's go inside the school. A very regimented class from 1909, with a schoolmaster standing at the top left, perhaps. We heard that the boys did come to school, came to church from the school on Sunday. If anyone fancies creeping up to the gallery where they were seated, not even in the pew, but along the back bench, you can see the graffiti from where they've carved their names still into the woodwork there. And Dr. Guthrie also formed a girls' school, which is now the Faith Mission, which he formed in 1904. Dr. Guthrie's School for Boys was 1888. And here we meet the pensioner and part-time petrol pump attendant, Harry Richmond, at the Shell filling station that was on Lastwade Road. This is from 1961. The site is now Kirkland Court. I mean, I can identify Park Crescent behind with that telephone box that disappeared 3 or 4 years ago. And we're going to cross the road and we meet the Waltons. That's number 27 Lastwade Road. From our left, we have Nell, David and Chris. And the chap on the right is Jimmy Reed. Jimmy started as the messenger boy in 1942, and he took over the business when David Bolton retired in 1976. It's now a very different outlet called Curl's Salon, but still in commercial use. Let's go slightly further north, and this fascinating scene. In some ways, very little has changed there. This is the early 1900s. Kirk Farmhouse now has a slated roof, and there's now traffic lights at the junction, but it's still very recognisable. And we just pop in to a very well-groomed primary 6 class of Liberton School on Mount Vernon Road from 1952. Perhaps someone here was there. We go down the hill and we turn south again. Kirkbrae, 1913, when the hedgerows were only broken by the 3 houses on our right. Numbers 52, 54 and 56, that is, with Craigie Beer House on our left. Still no housing development 10 years later in 1923 on the right, but some more has started to appear on the left. And we take a left turn into Orchard Head Road. There's one part vehicle, a van belonging to David Withers, butcher and poulterer. And if we zoom in, these rear doors read, "Orders called for and promptly delivered." And these are the shops at Brayfoot, constructed in 1910. And we had everything here. We've got the baker, the butcher, the poulterer, stationer, tobacconist, post office, and a chemist. And some do remain extant, although other shops are now in residential use. And we note the method of delivery, of course, the horse and carts waiting outside for the next delivery. And this is Liberton Dams looking down Mayfield Road. And note the narrowing of the road as it crosses the Braid Burn. The cottage on the left with the man with the bicycle, that was accessed by a tiny bridge across the mill lade. And here's Liberton Dams 1917, and note the H&T Mooney, plumbers and slaters building on the right that's now long gone. The mill at Nether Liberton took its water supply from the Braid Burn. I think most of those are still there in private occupancy now, and that scene's from 1903. And this is the north we're going to reach. We stand at the junction of Gilmerton Road and Liberton Road over 100 years ago. It's still known as Good's Corner, and it's so called because the Good family ran the sawmill and joinery workshop there. It was the city boundary for the trams until the extension to Liberton Gardens in 1924. And just take a moment to look at some of the features of this photograph. The very right, the drinking fountain. And walk along the pavement, there's a timber shed for the tram drivers to sit down because they'd have to stand all day. And then on the other side, we see what looks to be two very well-dressed ladies pursuing, we think, a nanny, pushing a perambulator from the time. Now, at this point, we're going to head south, and I need to ask someone to put on the kettle across the road, possibly. Okay, we're now at the Liberton Dams terminus, December the 2nd, 1935. We can see the first of the King's buildings appearing at the background, and that is the Route 18 that was extended to Liberton Gardens from June 1947, but only on evening services. We usually hear of the 1 and the 7 being there, but seemingly the 18 made it up the hill too. 1905, and it's depicting the coming of the houses. We've got Kirkbrae to the left, Liberton Brae to the right, and to the extreme right, we've got the Blackford Glen Road. And we see here really Liberton starting to change from the small country village to what would become a suburb of Edinburgh. But now we go back 20 years, and we see how barren it all was. Why was this photo taken? Well, perhaps the photographer knew about the coming of houses and wanted something to preserve the image. And I would compare this to what we see now at Langloan. That, when I came to Liberton 10 years ago, that was all fields, and now it's full of houses. So jump forward to the 1910s, it shows how industrial Liberton Dams became. And if we look at the left of the bridge, you can see the sluice gate mechanism beside what was Laidlaw's Dairy. Okay, we're going to proceed up Liberton Brae, something I have never done to this day, but we're going to try. And we stop halfway and just look towards the city. Now, neither lady nor gent seem particularly concerned about any possible traffic, but look at the right of the road, and we see the beveled blocks for the cart wheels and the rough infill between the tracks, and that was to assist horses, often on their way to Pennycook, the paper mills there, how to get up the hill with the beveled blocks. Slightly further south, and again we see the beveled blocks at the bottom right of the photograph, but the action's on the other side of the road where they're laying the tram lines to reach Liberton Gardens. And perhaps the irony is that it looks as though the rails are being delivered by horse, along with the ballast. And at the corner, this is 1924. The tram's still not reached us yet, but we think the sheep went down, well, we think we went up to one of the farms, but why they ever went down Liberton Brae is a mystery. And it really is an impossible act now from a time when life was just simpler. And that little road there, latest form of mechanism on Alnwick Hill Road, but in some ways, but for the lack of hard hats, that's not a scene that's too indifferent from today. And the one you've probably seen before, it is Saturday the 1st of June 1929. Car 349 on the 1 has run down from the terminus. That's a distance of about half a mile it's travelled. There were 4 people on board, but no fatalities, and it's come off the rails into the garden of number 40. There are 2 other photographs I've found, though. Here's it from the rear, with its oblique angle. But the bad news is more on this side when we see the damage done. The good news, though, is that it was repaired and pressed back into service. So, a canny Scotsman, I think, there. Here's one that has negotiated the curve. Car 23 cruises down Liberton Brae, unaffected by the lingering pockets of snow, and I suspect the date is February 1956 for reasons we'll come to later. And here's Liberton Brae 1923. Sturdy dumper trunk offloading concrete to hold the new tram tracks. But yet to think 33 years later, the last tram would have gone. Car 23 on the 7 passes Woolridge Road. Advert for Finlay Sheets, 5-year guarantee on the side. And let's pop into the Cadogan Road around 1923. One van, again parked there. We walk to the other end and we see Alnwick Hill Road looking north to Arthur's Seat. There might not be much traffic, but we note the telegraph poles, which seem to be the feature of the time as they sprung up. And prior to 1925, Liberton Drive was part of Kirkgate, and the railings on the left suggest that house building, on the north side at least, was not yet completed. But let's go back a bit further and see how rural that crossroad once was. Now, Gladys Montgomery sent me 2 photographs. This Meadowhead farm, which her cousin James Hamilton farmed. Obviously, ploughing could be 1940s, early 50s. And her uncle, who was also called James Hamilton, he had a dairy farm, and the photo is the vehicle he used for delivering milk in Liberton. This is Burnbury Cottage, the south side of Liberton Drive, which has long since disappeared, destroyed by fire. And a forerunner to Braid Hills Drive. This old road cut through what's now the Braid Hills Golf Course, and it ran a few hundred yards south of the present alignment. The lake has been drained to the relief of golfers now. Carrying on the water theme, this is the reservoir. It's only 1987, and it's easy to forget that that was there till about 10 years ago. Now, here's a postcard from 1930. And it read, "You would like it here. It is only 2pence car ride from the city, but quite country." And we note that there's a tram car that's arrived at the terminus, and this would have been the scene that greeted anybody walking from the south. There was a tram extension to Kames that was authorised in 1935, but for some reason it was never built. Not till the number 7 came along they could get to Kames. So let's walk towards the tram. I said earlier, 1956. Well, in September 1951, the council voted to initiate what it called its rationalisation programme of the tramway network. And the first route started to fall in 1952. So some termini around then quietly slipped from view, but by 1956, we could sense the end was coming, and it did in the November. So Liberton's often photographed as one of the last termini that was still in use. The Christopherson Route 1 was converted to motor bus on March the 28th, 1954, but the 7 continued until March the 11th, 1956. So here is car 7 on February the 18th, 1956, in its last days there. And note the stub end, not often photographed, that would have been where the extension ran. So let's turn into Kirkgate. There's a view of the neatly trimmed hedges in September 1965. We go back a bit earlier though, and we see that in 1937 there was only 1 gas light for the whole of Kirkgate. All the original iron railings still in position, and note the Anderson Hall in the distance. Well, like then, the Anderson Hall is very busy, so let's pop in and see what's happening. This is the Liberton Drama Group in the production of Random Harvest in January 1964. Now, my thanks to David Lamb for identifying persons within this photograph. He says the lady in the foreground, behind the teacup, is Christine Seaton. On her right, in the white blouse, is Sheila Moncur, who acted in a lot of plays up to the 1980s. The man in the morning coat on the right is Jimmy Robertson. The other person in the background is George Goody, who was a lecturer at King's Buildings, and his wife Ruth was the daughter of Bryce Gould, who was organist here. And we think the other lady facing to the right is Mina Hogarth, but the others we don't know. And this is the Halloween party and concert by the girls of St. Hilda's School. That is in the Anderson Hall, and it's from 1935. Now, I don't think the next 2 are in the church halls, but they're interesting to look at. Liberton Secondary School Parents Association dance in November 1964. And here we have the Liberton Young Unionists meeting in October 1963 with Member of Parliament Michael Hutchison. So let's cross the roads and go into the church. And let's hopefully hear Richard Cunningham at the organ, the previous organ, and witness the venerable Harry Peck in the days when we had church officers who beadled. And a younger John Cameron would like to start the service. Well, we better not disturb it, so let's go back outside. The former Liberton Inn was once the village school, and between the school signs reads "School, drive slowly," but there's not much happening as regards road traffic. Now, these next two are from Elizabeth Mercer, and they show the old house that was once on the corner. And note how the building extended right the way up to the road without a pavement, and how narrow Mount Vernon Road was at that time. And just a slightly different angle showing the full house. And we continue along Mount Vernon Road. Kingston House on the left and Liberton Northfield Church on the right from 1900. And I want to end with a question. This shows Liberton Dairy, but its location is unknown. The design of that shop doesn't match anything that's ever been identified. Not at Lasswade Road, nor Liberton Gardens, nor Brayfoot. But perhaps you know the answer.
Well, what a wonderful conversation we have had. That is absolutely fantastic. There's nothing better than reminiscing about past times and looking through lots of old photographs. And I know just from the murmurs that I've heard from various people round about that, you know, names have been mentioned, people have oohed and ahed, and various comments have been made. So it definitely has been an afternoon for remembering good times. So can I just say thank you very much indeed again to Anne, Elizabeth, Bill, Pearl for a wonderful poem and a real tribute to Wilma Monroe. Very good, very, very good. And also to Alan for so ably leading the discussion and using his detective skills. If it hadn't been for his detective skills, I don't think we would have found out about Margot leading the guild that night, Wilma's poem, and Sally, I believe, was responsible for unearthing the 206 Liberton Kirk magazine. Is that not correct? Sally Cuthbert, who's sitting very quietly there. So a great deal of work has gone into this afternoon. And Callum, who has really stimulated a lot of thought and conversation with his fantastic photographs and sharing them so well with us. And Gary and John up there doing our technical support. And Jill and everybody who's busy making you all a cup of tea or coffee. And I know that there's lots of cake, lots of lovely cake. So thank you very much indeed for the bakers as well, who have all helped to produce the baking for this afternoon. So once again, can we just say thank you very much indeed to everybody.